Ben, can you give us a little bit of background and history?
Sure, Tom, thanks for having me today. So been in the industry for over 35 years. Started out as a security officer back in the day when I was going to college. Eventually went into guard force management, and then had a great opportunity to go to Drexel University and head up their security program. And from there went to the University of Sciences, spent a few years. And then my colleagues told me I went to the dark side. Went to work for a security integrator. Learned as much as I could as their director of business development, and eventually had learned enough that I felt very comfortable going into the consulting side of the business.
Yeah, that's quite a background, and I know I've been looking forward to having this conversation. That you have a lot of experience, and we're always, as our team is always looking to educate, learn more about the industry, learn more about how we can be effective with customers. In our role for many, many years, what we do is site surveys. So, that is meeting with customers, finding out what problems they're trying to solve, risks they're trying to mitigate, and then developing a physical security solution to reduce and mitigate that threat. So it's always based on product and applying it. I'd like to hear from your perspective as a consultant and someone who is very, very versed at security vulnerability assessments, how that differs, and it's I find it really interesting and how that can help us learn more too.
Yeah, so when we go out and we do a security assessment, we're essentially looking at threats and potential hazards. And that could either be to a population or a critical infrastructure or a building. And then from there, once we identify what those threats and vulnerabilities are, we then come up and figure out how we reduce and mitigate risk. So it could be either hardening a facility through access control, CCTV, or it could be policies and procedures. So it really takes the entire gauntlet of the security practices and what are the best practices today and moving forward into the future.
What is the, I like this, we had this brief discussion earlier about the difference between a vulnerability and a risk. And I know there's a little bit of gray area, but vulnerability, I think we determined, was sort of a little more gray, where a risk is a little more defined and potentially a little more black and white. I'd be interested to hear your perspective on those two.
Yeah, so it's interesting, just to keep it simple, think of a vulnerability as a problem that you want to solve, right? And then the risk is how much, how willing are you to not correct the problem, right? So everything has a scale. And it could be driven by cost, it could be driven by resources, it could be driven by the physical structure of a facility. But you have to weigh what that vulnerability is to the risk. Insurance companies use risk, very similar to what we refer to as a cyber score today, where you might want to look and see how your network's performing, so you can get the best discounts on cyber insurance. You might have somebody come in and do an assessment or a risk assessment of your network. And at that particular time, you might get a score. And when that score, it says if you do X, Y, Z, you can raise that score. So essentially, when I go in and do a physical assessment of a property, those are the type of things I'm looking to bring back to my client to say, here's what we discovered. If you do X, Y, Z, you can start lowering that risk and mitigating that risk and being more responsible to what you're looking for at the end.
So I guess I think a specific term, like a loading dock door in the back of a warehouse facility, that might be a vulnerability to that client's mind. Risk is what they can associate it with it. I store valuable laptops here, and the risk is I need to protect that area from laptops getting stolen or things like that. So that is a vulnerability, and now I'm associating a risk, a known equation to that vulnerability.
Yeah, so when we talk about doing risk, there's quantitative and qualitative, right, vulnerabilities and risk. So you're actually weighing it and saying, okay, what am I willing to live with at this particular point, right? It's very similar to what we talk about even when you buy car insurance, right? You're paying in the event that something happens, right? That's not going to, just because you have car insurance, it's not going to lower your risk of getting into an accident, right? But if you do defensive driving training, you have onboard systems, maybe an alarm in your system to stop it from being stolen, GPS tracking, those type of things. All of a sudden now you can reduce your insurance rates, right? So the same thing really applies when you're looking at risk or lowering that risk or mitigating that risk. What can we do to mitigate that risk, regardless if it's a school, a high-rise office building? What can we do to control those threats or those, as we refer to it, as vulnerabilities?
What do you see as the state of the industry right now, or things that have changed from your perspective, maybe general concerns that you're hearing from clients that are different than in previous years? I can imagine there are some significant ones.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because I think a lot of what my clients look at is they see what's happening on TV, right? And they see that, maybe it's the FBI drama that's on TV or something like that, and they're drilling in from miles away and getting facial recognition of a person. So I'll get those questions, can we really do this? Or how come I can't even get a clear image of that person in my lobby and the camera's 10 feet away?
We battle Hollywood quite a bit.
Yeah, it really is battling Hollywood, right? So when we look at it, it's really, what steps do we have to take to be proactive, right? Stay out of that reactive mode, be proactive, look at the state of the industry, and everything right now is about data. And how do you get that data? If it's coming from your CCTV systems, your access control systems, your alarm systems, it's about not only about security, but security being part of the business, right? Creating safe and secure environments where people can excel. It doesn't matter if it's a college, a K through 12 school, high-rise office building, pharmaceutical, whatever it is. If people feel safer in the workplace, they're going to perform a lot higher, at a much higher level.
Ben, how often do influences that we don't think about kind of weigh into this equation? Meaning, for example, in higher learning, how often do people ask the question about the state of security at a facility, or how often do parents in public school systems or even private school systems ask the question, what are you doing to mitigate these things, or have you done something to mitigate these things? Same thing would go for a person deciding to go to work for a company. How often does that question come up, and does it seem to affect the need for a security vulnerability assessment?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that what we see today is a lot of those type of questions come up depending on what's happening right now in the industry, right? So in the event of an active shooter situation that occurs at a school or in an office building, you're going to get those questions a lot more. But like everything else, sometimes it quiets down and people aren't asking those questions.
Because it's not in the headlines,
It's
or
not
it's
in the
not
headlines,
in the
yep.
public attention.
But they should be asking those questions all the time. When I was in charge of security at Drexel University, it was rare we'd get up and we'd do our presentation, but it was rare that I would have a parent come up to me afterwards and say, how safe is the campus? Or how safe can you keep my student or my daughter or my son? And my response always was, I can't guarantee it, but the one thing I can do is how safe and secure your daughter or son allows us to have them be, that I can control. So if they're going to listen to what we have to say, not walk the streets in the middle of the night, make sure they lock their doors, make sure they park their cars in the right places, don't leave valuables out, watch over their computers and everything. Those are the type of things that we can control, but everybody has to have part of it.
And even when you talk about things like that in the commercial space or the federal space or anywhere out in industry, things about wearing your ID badge. Does everybody have their ID badge? Is it visible above their waistline? And if not, what's the process? Are people challenging them? Where's your ID badge? Tailgating, I swipe my badge and I'm allowed to go through the door, but I hold the door out of courtesy for the person behind me, and I don't make that person badge in. Those are kind of processes too that I think that from the public perspective or from a consumer perspective, we have to get used to doing more and more, because that's a vulnerability, right?
Yep. And it's interesting you mentioned about just wearing IDs, right? Very low cost on the tree. Yeah. But to get people convinced to doing it, I don't want to wear my ID, or I forgot my ID, or those type of things. But they don't realize how safe it makes everybody else around them, because now you can question that person who's not wearing an ID. I have a client that
or if you don't want to question them, you call the security force, right? Or the police department, and say, hey, there's a guy running around on the third floor who doesn't have an ID on.
Yeah, one of the clients I worked with on doing their security assessment, part of it was to go and see how quickly I could get into all their floors. So I was able to get into 8 floors in 10 minutes just by piggybacking in behind our employees. Now, the nice part was all the employees were really nice, but the other part was nobody ever questioned me.
But there's a difference between being nice and being conscious. I don't, we were all taught as young people to hold the door open for the next person in line. Everybody across the line has to be accepting of the fact that I can't do that. And I'm expected, if I want to be safe and secure on my floor, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to close the door and you're going to have to swipe in. It's just one of those things in today's society that, again, back to a vulnerability. If I'm willing to accept the risk that I'm going to let somebody in the floor who's going to take something or going to have access to information that I don't want them to have access to, or they may harm me or other people that I'm working with, then they're going to hold the door open. If they accept the need to make sure that person has the access to the floor, then they're going to have to say, I'm sorry, we're going to have to close the door and you're going to have to swipe in.
Right. So when you think about it, the access control system, the CCTV system in the hallways and the elevator lobbies were put in for a reason, right? They were all about being proactive, the ability to control who can enter and exit your facility and monitor who's coming and going. It was interesting that when you take a security vulnerability assessment, it's not always about the hardware. Sometimes it's just about planning, practicing, and training people.
Processes.
The processes, right? So the next time I go back and I try to do the same thing, I get stopped 5 times out of the 7.
Then that was a good investment.
It was a great investment because people would say, can you show me your ID, or can you use your ID to enter?
And it doesn't have to be, a mega $1 million system or a complex setup of multiple systems, just something very simple.
Our industry has led over the years, many years, with video surveillance and access control. But now we've seen an evolution that if I see something, I now need to be able to say something. And that message is likely to be different depending on the area and depending on the event that's going on. So I'm just curious, what are you starting to see? Because we talked about the changes in industry, and obviously you've seen multiple changes. Are you seeing more of that requirement for communication, mass notification, and getting a message out there? Is that a growing concern with clients?
I think not only is it a growing concern, but it's becoming common practice. Yeah. There's nowhere you can go, even when I travel now, I get messages from my airline, text messages saying this is what's happening, or we have a problem. My daughter's school, snow emergency the other day, there was no snow on the ground, but they were texting saying you need to come and pick up your daughter because we're closing school because of a pending snowstorm. Right? So when you look at those type of things, that ability to give information out, not only to help mitigate the risk of the school, right, but also to allow people to make conscious decisions of what they're going to do. So if you think about it, when I talk about people trying to decide if they're going to open or close schools or open or close businesses, it's not necessarily about, we're going to have to shut down or those type of things, but it's the risk about you're putting people out on the road, you're putting those school buses out on the road. Do we really need to do this in this day and age, right? So if you think about it, think about back in the day in snow days, right? When I was growing up in the Philadelphia area.
Come on, don't say it. You didn't walk uphill bare feet.
I did. I walked uphill 2 miles, 3 foot of snow.
And you were happy to do it.
But it was less common to have those type of things. But now we're seeing it more often. Now I get on my watch, I get tornado warnings or thunderstorm warnings or those type of things. So now I can make a conscious decision on how I'm going to protect myself. And I think things like the See Something, Say Something campaigns, and I wonder how much we're going to have to pay the government because they did trademark it. The problem, I think, that in the industry-wide is that there's so many options available, right? So you have the 3-letter acronyms out there are all developing their own reporting systems and everything. You have school systems, businesses all using different systems. So you also have to, migrate that, look at that and say, okay, what's going to be the best solution for what I need to do, and without overcomplicating it. And I think a big part of that, what happened was about communications and things that are happening in the marketplace right now with FirstNet and first responders and those type of things, having access to those phone lines, those information lines and networks and things to get that information out to keep people safe. And it's really being driven a lot to the community perspective of how safe and secure communities are.
And your perspective is great. What is the best technology to get that messaging out there? All of them. Digital signage, text messages on all of our smartphones, audible across any any device which has a speaker on that campus, whether it's a two-way radio, whether it's an intercom, whether it's a VoIP phone. So all of these are the right things and the right way to get messages out. It just depends on what that message is, whether it's weather event or a hostile event.
And how you need to get it out.
Correct.
Absolutely.
Correct. So that's the big change that I've seen in our industry.
I'd be interested to know, what do you see as the biggest challenges and the biggest risks from your perspective from a person that goes around multiple type operations and gets the opportunity to evaluate?
Yeah, so the biggest thing I see, and been doing it for a few years now, and even back in the days of higher ed and guard force management, common sense. Common sense type of things like locking your doors, right? Asking questions of people that you don't recognize who they are, stopping people who are walking out with big packages, people who are parked,
who are walking in with big
big packages, or walking in with duffel bags and those type of things. I always look at it as when we look at doing an assessment, there's a couple things that we look at, right? One is prevention, right? It all begins with that. So if you're familiar with your surroundings, the people you work with and those type of things, what programs do you have in place to prevent something to happen to begin with, right? And that really becomes a key. Then it becomes, the other part of it is looking at and saying, okay, how do I look at mitigating that risk? What kind of programs can put in place to make safer and more secure surroundings for everybody? And then it's the planning and the training and the hardening of the infrastructure. So they all play an integral part in what we do, but the basic foundation is that prevention part, the ability to say, go back to say, see something, say something, right? All of a sudden, Johnny's talking about having a bad day, coming in talking about killing his supervisor. By the way, somebody should know about that, right? Or, if we look at some of the recent situations that occurred that were mitigated or prevented, where students actually came forward and said, oh, so-and-so posted on Facebook or they posted on Instagram that they were going to come back and kill everybody. Now we're looking at a real threat. We have something that's in writing, something that law enforcement can look at and investigate.
When we talk about law enforcement, and you touched upon this a little bit, the change in our industry, how much are you seeing part of the conversation with the facility of having better dialogue with law enforcement, first responders, hospitals, maybe neighboring facilities? In my perspective, there needs to be that community discussion when you're looking at improving your security as an end user of that facility, that maybe I want to get, and in today's world of mobile capability, I can give video surveillance and lockdown capabilities and all those to anybody I want to. So working with local law enforcement, I think, would be key, especially if you're a college campus or hospital.
Yeah, and it's not only working with law enforcement, but federal, state, take to everybody who's involved with it. It's looking at and bringing people in and saying we're doing an assessment. Like the state police of Pennsylvania are now offering to come in and do assessments of K through 12 schools. Yeah. That is great. Now you have to get in line to do it because there's only so many people that can go out there and do it. So then you rely on professionals like myself and other security consultants to come out and help with it. But at the end of the day, the ability to communicate immediately to law enforcement that there's an issue, or get them involved in the beginning to say, if we have an incident, how are you going to respond? What is it that we can do to help you in the event that you respond? What type of training programs can we put in place for our students, faculty, and staff, or our employees? And what can we expect if you do come in? Because everybody's going to have a different expectation. And even if you look at the initiatives being taken by the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA and everything about communities, getting communities involved, if you haven't had an opportunity to go visit their updates to their website recently, I really encourage it, because the information that you can now get on their website on developing a plan, executing a plan, practicing that plan, being in contact with the people that you need to be in contact with, who to follow on Twitter for information, right, is all there. So nobody's sitting in the dark anymore saying, how can I do this?
Is there, when we talk about different types of facilities, houses of worship, things like that, is there a typical size or type of facility that responds well to a security vulnerability assessment? Who do you typically see that you work with or has that demand?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is you don't want to work with somebody who's being told they have to do it.
That's an interesting point.
It's the worst room to walk into, where they're being dictated by their boss that they want to have this done, especially if that person's a professional themselves and are looking at it saying, well, why am I hiring a consultant to do this when I can do it myself? Well, there's two things that happen, right? One is either the leadership doesn't have the faith and the trust in you that you've done it, or that there's something that's happened that they're being asked questions. So, you know, from my point of view as a security consultant, my job is to go in there and to help. My job isn't to go in there and say, everything's so screwed up, you know, you need to get rid of this person, you need to do this, you need to do that. My responsibility is to go in, talk to the stakeholders, find out what the issues are, and then come up with a reasonable plan that makes sense for everybody. If it's installing cameras, access control, even if it's just basic things like encouraging people to wear their ID cards. It's just you have to start somewhere. So like you said earlier, it's, you know, the worst thing you can do is not do anything, right? So what I always tell people is, here's a list of things, let's start knocking these off the list.
So what do you do to get the buy-in of all those stakeholders? What do you do when you have lots of different departments, lots of different people, and they will have their own operational concerns? How do you make sure you address everybody's concerns and make sure that you reassure them that you're not there to make their jobs or make their lives harder, you're just there to make them more secure?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, I think the key is you have to have really good listening skills, and you have to be able to read the audience and understand not only who the stakeholders are, but who the decision makers are. And a lot of times, sometimes you go into these rooms and these meetings, and the decision maker's not in the room. You know, and it's kind of like, okay, what do I have to do to get to that decision maker? But you have to make people feel comfortable that they're going to be willing to share information and not feel as though they're being attacked or they're vulnerable to the situation, that we all have a common goal. So the first thing I do is I go in and I meet with people and essentially say, I'm here to help you, but I can't help you if you're not willing to help yourself. And then what we do is we establish some goals and objectives. Then we start talking about what the problems are. Then we start talking about a scope of work. And then after all that's done, we look at it and we say, okay, are we ready to do an assessment? Is everybody on the same page of what we want to accomplish here? I put a proposal together, send it out, get everybody to buy into it, that this is what we want to do. And then continuously what I feel is that you have to own the project. You have to be willing to communicate and talk to people. If it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you have to be willing to do that.
One of the things you started off with was explaining that we do a lot of site surveys, and you have a level of expertise with vulnerability assessments, site vulnerability assessments. What is, I mean, we've talked a little bit about a lot of different topics, but what's the meat of a site vulnerability assessment versus a site survey? Because I think that's important to know who to call and when to call. I think that's a big piece of this, right?
Yeah, so I look at a vulnerability as more of we're looking at those threats, right? And we're looking at the problems and how to solve those problems. The survey is really bringing people in who are even maybe more of a subject matter expert than I am when it comes to technology or whatever it is, to say, oh yeah, Ben, I understand what your vision is. Here's what we can do to get you there or get your client there. And that's where it's really important to have somebody come in and know, I can put this camera in this particular corner and I'm going to get this depth of the field and this low lighting conditions. Whereas a security consultant, I don't have that knowledge in my brain all the time.
And it changes.
And it does change,
Technology
right?
changes quickly.
I mean, I remember before is that we would install cameras and you would expect them to last 10 years. Now I'm looking at cameras and I'm telling my clients, all right, you need to be prepared to look at things in 3-year increments now. And then new technology is coming out every 18 months. And how do you decide which one's the best for that solution? Or how about the one that you spec out in a job is no longer that model anymore? You know, so looking at those type of things. So where I look to bring people in is the process is I go in, I do the assessment, and at that particular time I look and see who are the best people to bring into this project. Who are the individuals that can get this project to the next level once we get to that particular point. And it's always great to have partners at the table. People that can come in and maybe shed a little bit different light or, hey, by the way, did you know this technology existed?
Okay. One of the other things that I think affects all this is there's been a lot of mandate where entities, we'll just call them entity, whether they be federal, state, or local, kind of try to apply force downward on customers to say, we want you to have a certain level of security. I think that's warranted in today's society and in today's world. But how does that affect what you're doing when you're doing the site vulnerability assessment?
Yeah, the key is you really have to know not only the the site, but you also need to know the regulations. What is the expectation of it? What is it the letter of the law that it's got to be, it's black and white and it's got to be this, or is there a little bit of gray there? And then the other part of it is, what is the commitment level of the client that you're working with? Are they just bringing you in to check boxes off a sheet, right? Oh yeah, we had our security assessment done. But at the end of the day, are they going to do anything about the information that you bring them? At Largo, one of the things that we look at is we take all that, we want to work with customers that want to have impact change. We find it very difficult to work with somebody who just wants to check boxes off the sheet, right, the checklist. What we want to do is we want to work and we say, we're going to be a partner in this, but we want you to look at it and say, how can we help you continue this process on? When I first got involved in consulting, I thought it was going to be great to go in, get a job done, and move on. And then what I found out was that was not the case, is that if you do a good job for somebody, they want you around. And I've even had clients joke with me where I would go back and recommend in my assessment that they needed to hire a director of security, and them coming back to me and saying, why do we need to hire a director of security if we have you? You know, if you can answer our questions for us, be there for us, why do we need to go out and hire somebody?
And you're available at 10 o'clock at night.
And I'm available at 10 o'clock at night, right? Yeah, because I don't sleep. So at the end of the day, I think that's an important part of it. It's not only knowing what the rules and the regulations are, but working with people who really care.
The buy-in again.
It is really. It's you got to have people that buy in.
It's interesting. Optional versus mandated is a big thing, right? Again, it's that feeling of I'm being told I have to do something versus, I think I have a problem and I really want to do something. And I think that's a big thing. But there are implications, right? I mean, even if it is that process of checking a box, if there are mandates and somebody doesn't do something, what is the risk then?
Well, first there's the monetary risk. Where are the fines they're going? And then there are some organizations that are so big they can just afford to pay the fines. Sure. It's cheaper to pay the fines than it is to make the corrections. So it's weighing those type of things at the same time. But back to I think one of the key points in this is getting that buy-in from people. It's also finding the right people that you want to work with, because not every security integrator that's installing the access control CCTV system is aware of the rules and the regulations. So finding the right people who can support what it is that you need to have done and have that clear understanding can make it easier for everybody.
So somebody who may be specialized in a specific area that it caters more to who I am as a customer.
Yeah, for example, if I got a call tomorrow and said, hey, Ben, can you come out and take a look at our petrochem facility? I wouldn't even know where to start, right? So at that particular time, I'm either going to refer the individual to somebody else, or I'll partner with somebody and bring them to the table. But you have to know your limits.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess part of, this is interesting that I just thought of it, part of a vulnerability can also be associated with liability too. So let's say there's a parking garage next to a hospital and there's no means of communication in there. Does it open a door for liability? And I also think about in the recent active shooting event that happened in Jacksonville, Florida at the Jacksonville Gaming Conference. Within 2 days after that event, all the headlines were about the lawsuits that were being filed, liability against that and them not doing enough. So I guess vulnerability, you're also thinking liability as well with customers.
Yeah, you have to go into it and think along those lines. So occasionally I'll have customers ask me, and I'll give you an example, right? Emergency call boxes, the tall towers. I'll constantly be asked, do we need to update these or should we take them out? Well, why are you taking them out? Well, we're taking them out maybe because we can't afford to get them fixed or maintain them all the time. Well, that's not a good reason. You can. But what's your solution? What are you going to offer instead? And people are like, well, everybody carries cell phones now. Yeah, but how strong is your cell phone network, and how quickly are people responding to it, and those type of things. So you look at it and say, okay, the attorneys are going to say, probably way on the other side, and say, do not take those out. They've been here. There's an expectation that they're there. There's an expectation of reasonable security and safety. So where we get into the situation of trying to figure out the liability part of it, a lot of times you don't know until you get in front of a jury.
Yeah.
And the jury decides what's happening. And then, and on the political side of it is what's happening and what laws and things are being passed to mitigate some of these things. What are we putting in place to help the security professional, help the owners of businesses provide safer and more secure environments for people?
And I think you hit on something earlier too that always comes back. Somebody's got a system in place now and it's either outdated or degraded or needs updating, and do we do that or do we rip it out? When you put together a site survey, a system itself, how do you put in there about maintaining and the cost? And because I think so many people, again, are in that analog world of, I buy something today and it's going to last 10, 12, 15 years. It's not the case, typically.
Yeah, so and a lot of stuff that we talk about now is about future proofing, right? Going in and not only is an assessment about what your threats are and your potential hazards are, but an assessment can also be looking at where your current state is, right? What's the current state of my access control system? What's the current state of my CCTV system? What do I need to get from A to B? And how am I going to pay to do it, right? There's a ton of legacy systems out there, right? I saw a client the other day that still had a VCR hooked up and was still changing out tapes. And they're paying a premium for tapes now.
Oh, yeah.
It's like,
yeah.
Forget, you could have afforded this already. So as part of that, I think the responsibilities of a security consultant is going in and looking at that and providing a roadmap to keep the client on track so that they're constantly looking at and upgrading their systems and being cost conscious about it, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be done all today, but let's look at a 2-year, 3-year plan of what's happening and then coming up with an end of life cycle so that you know that 10 years down the road from now, you're going to have to prepare for this. Or you know that this technology, or keeping aware of the technology going in and saying, oh, by the way, this was discontinued, right? So it's having that clear understanding and being able to talk to people. And that's why I think that in the security consulting businesses, a security consultant can't do it all on their own. You have to get out and you have to talk to the professionals that put who rep the systems and those type of things. So you can talk to them and say, what's coming down the road? What can I expect? Tom and I we have conversations about cameras all the time. What can I expect that's coming down the road 3 years from now? I need to see your roadmap, right? Yeah. Before it was analog cameras, then it went to 720, then it went to 1080p, then now it's 4K. Is 4K going to be the standard moving forward? Probably, because everybody's talking about 4K in their living rooms, right? And that pretty much drives the marketplace. I always tell my clients and people I work with is that if you want to get a sense of where the security industry is, go to the Consumer Electronics Show. That's going to tell you what people are going to expect. So if I'm looking at that 4K monitor in my house, oh man, I better get that 4K monitor in my dispatch center eventually. So those are the things you need to prepare for. And I think that's where a security consultant can really have value. Not in just looking at the threats and the potential, but protecting your investment long term.
Basically, the two of us do very similar roles. But ours, like you said, is more applying technology to solve a problem. But whereas you are looking at vulnerabilities, and I could get into this college dorm 8 times with 10 tries, in my mind, why should somebody reach out to you and the value that you can offer and develop with that SVA? It's giving them a better understanding of what problems they can expect.
Yeah, sometimes it's just having another set of eyes on the problem to bring it to everybody's attention and look at different solutions. I think that one of the things I've run into a lot, and I try to discourage, is people who sit there and say, we tried that 5 years ago. That's great, you tried it 5 years ago, but technology is different, things are different today, maybe we try something different, right? So, when you look at those type of things where you have people getting in a dorm or you're getting into an office building or those type of things, we didn't have technology to help us with that before, right? The ability to track people as they're walking into the building, the ability to go back and do investigative solutions on video analytics or analysis and saying, oh yeah, I need to see everybody who's wearing a red shirt. Imagine me coming to somebody and saying that 15 years ago. I want to see everybody in a red shirt. First of all, you had to hope that everybody had color cameras in, right, to be able to do it. But nowadays, it's really becoming commonplace. And if you don't have those technologies available to you, you're really behind the curve. So when we talk about, Hollywood driving some security, I think it really is in those type of things. So, when I talk to clients and we're talking about, and we had a conversation a little bit earlier today about mobile credentialing, the ability to be able to do everything in the palm of your hand, control your access, remotely monitor your systems, all those type of things. It's great. But what's the next thing? So today I can use this to get into my turnstile, right? But this is going to go away in a couple of years and it's all going to be facial recognition. And that's what I try to keep my clients abreast of, is that, okay, yeah, we're going to start here, we're going to future-proof, we're going to put readers in, Bluetooth readers in, that can read various credentials and those type of things. But the next step is going to be facial recognition. So you might as well forget about everything that we're doing today, and let's start thinking about how we're moving and keeping these turnstiles proactive moving forward.
Yeah, it's moving away from the handheld type of credential to a more biometric, and biometric read rates are getting quicker, so it's becoming more, and all those technologies are improving facial identification. So yeah, I think it's interesting to see where the technology is going to take our industry.
You've talked about a lot of different things. I mean, all these topics that you do when you go out there. How long does it take to do a site vulnerability assessment?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You know, being in the industry a long time, I can pretty much walk in and get a sense of how long something's going to take, and it can take anywhere from a couple hours to weeks.
Would it be fair to say that a lot of those things that we had talked about a little while ago, where there's different mandated type agencies or organizations, if I'm a facility that has to live within those rules and regulations, it's going to take a little longer than, hey, we would like you to come in and do a quick survey and give us your input on how we can just improve day-to-day security. Mm-hmm. So would it be fair to say that, you know, if it's an entity that is under control or under mandate to do some specific things, it's going to take a little longer than?
Yeah, so back in my integration days, we'd work with consultants, we'd work in the integration, we'd work with the end user, and those type of things could actually take months to do, because you're looking at the different pieces and how they're all connected to each other and looking at those type of things. So a nuclear facility, right? High level of regulations. So not only are you checking off the boxes on a checklist, but you have to make sure all those things are physically working the way they should be. And that becomes a big part of, you know, the commissioning structure. How do you commission something to make sure it's working as it was promised or how it was delivered? How many times have you heard, or people in the audience have heard, where a system's installed and it's not working for years, you know, and you're trying to figure out why it's not working? Was it that the integrator didn't have trained professionals on how to do it? Did the salesperson oversell what it was going to do?
It might even be related to the site.
How about just not having a network connection?
Exactly.
A friend of mine told me a story, is that it was funny, we were in a deep conversation about how you solve problems. And this particular problem was happening in Germany. And they had won the contract to put access control and CCTV in all these locations around global. And this one site, it just wasn't working. And they couldn't figure out why it wasn't working. Tech support, hours and hours and thousands of dollars spent on this situation. And the individual I was talking to said, eventually he called the client up, I'm going to be traveling in Europe, I'll swing by, stop at your facility, see what's going on. And he goes to their IT person and says, you know, can we see what's going on? Can you show me the install and everything? And he goes in and he looks and he's like, what's this plug for? This is a true story. And plugs it into the outlet, and all of a sudden the system comes up and working. So, you know, sometimes it's just the simplest things like those type of things where, you know, we don't have to look at it as being a major problem, but drilling down to it and saying, what's the simplest common denominator to resolve this issue? And I think that's where you get in situations where, mandated by the government or whatever the regulations are, is that sometimes, you know, they get in there and they start doing all these things, but they don't, that 5 or 10% never gets completed.
Right.
I know when I started in the industry, a lot of our customers completely reassessed all their security every 10 to 15 years. They planned to replace whatever they had every decade or so. Do you have a recommendation on how often an organization should reassess their security nowadays?
Yeah, so my recommendation to my clients is every year, going back in and looking at their system. It could be a cursory review of the system, and then probably at some point, maybe every third year, coming in and do a full assessment. Simple things like when we look and we propose assessments and we come back with our findings, one of the things that we always recommend is developing a preventive maintenance program. The ability to twice a year, 3 times a year, 4 years a year, depending on the regulations of the facility maybe, driving it, having coming in and checking all the point-to-points, making sure everything's working as it should be. Nothing's worse than getting in somewhere and saying, oh yeah, that door was alarmed, but we haven't gotten an alarm on that door for 5 years. Let's just all assume it works. And you go back there, and then during construction, you find out the door contact was ripped out, right? So that's that 5%, 10% we're talking about, that at the end of the day, before, when they ripped the door out, somebody should have just checked it again. And that's a big thing of what I see happening all the time. And that's why we encourage people to go in and do at least a year. And one of the things we work with our clients is actually training them and their staff on ways they can do it themselves. So if you have a security officer roving your campus or your building, how about saying, check those doors. I want you to open those doors and see if the dispatcher back at the command and control center gets an alarm. That's a no cost item, right? You're not even bringing out somebody to do it for you and paying them hours to do it, but you have somebody checking in on a regular basis. Find a problem, now you're being proactive. Now you can address those issues, get them fixed, and reduce that risk.
So do you offer different types of assessments or levels of assessment?
You know, it's interesting. I sometimes get asked that question about what level of assessments do we do. It's really dictated by what the project is and what that scope of work is. A lot of times somebody will ask for something, but they don't clearly understand what it is that they're asking for. So what we do is we go in and we ask those questions, and that's why, as I mentioned earlier, it's about meeting with those key stakeholders, getting a complete understanding of what it is that they want to accomplish at the end of the day, and then coming back and saying, oh, here's what we can do. One of the things that we like to do is we like to go in and kind of create like a menu and say, let's start here, and then we'll do this first, and then if there's a need to do this, we'll come back and do this. I think the thing that drives me crazy and other security professionals crazy is when you see risk assessments and it's boilerplate information. Or sometimes I'll get asked to come in because somebody did an assessment and the client wasn't happy with the assessment. There's nothing worse than having to go in and critique somebody else's work, and you have to find a way to do it because, you know, everybody's in that business. But when you look through a proposal and your client's first concern is that so-and-so put the name of another company in their recommendations, it's like, oh yeah, they did the word search, but they missed this particular one. And it's a dark cloud on security consultants. It's a dark cloud on the security industry. So making sure you establish those roles in the beginning, I think, is really important.
So I think that brings up another question in my mind. You're talking about a document that you're handing to somebody. What's that? What is that document, or what is that proposal, or what is that product that you're handing to the customer? What does that look like?
Yeah, so it's interesting you said that because it can range anywhere from a single sheet of paper to a binder that has all the resource information, all the source information. It could be documents that we're providing from source documents to help present our findings. So I may go in and find some best practices from ASIS or Department of Homeland Security or FEMA, and we'll actually provide some of those source documents. So one client, we actually had to create 2 binders. One binder was the actual assessment, and another binder was all the source materials that they could go back and look at. And that was one of the things that our attorneys were looking for, was not only come in and do our assessment for us, but you need to quote where you're getting your sources from. So, and that brings that whole other level of responsibility to the table of being able to have those resources available to you. It's a lot easier now today with Google than it was before, because now I can even go and say, Alexa, search such and such, and you know, I get a whole list of things, or I ask Siri and I get a whole list of things on my phone, and I can look at it and say, you know, here's what we need to concentrate on, here's some really great source documents. I think the problem with that is that it's also made it easy for people to become consultants or to say they're consultants. And that's one of the things I think that people need to be aware of.
So what does that look like? Again, you keep making me ask more questions about this. What do the qualifications look like for somebody who, you know, the credentials and the qualifications, what kind of training, so on and so forth, experience?
Yeah, so I think the great thing is that there's a lot of organizations that you can go out and get accredited. So I'm a CPP, I'm a certified protection professional from ASIS. I go to ASIS every year to keep my credentials up. I've been involved with them for over 25 years. I've also served on the Campus Safety and Security Council for 18 years. So I think it's important that not only is it about the knowledge that you've gained through your experience, but it's also about the book knowledge and keeping current with the times, going to different educational programs. I've attended some of the programs from Mid-Chess on video analytics and video and those type of things. And they're all very valuable because you need to keep up to date with those type of things. I think where people, and along that same line is making people sure people have the right insurances, you know, professional liability insurances, general liability insurance, whatever it is that you're going to be doing, you need to ask those questions of your security consultant. Because this particular day is that, you know, I'm retiring and I think I'll take up security consulting. Well, okay, that doesn't mean you're going to be a great security consultant, right? Me, myself, I think of it every time I go in and do another assessment, I'm always learning. I'm always learning how to do my job better and going back and asking those questions.
Well, you want to challenge yourself, and that helps your deliverable for that customer.
Yeah, and then, you know, and the same thing goes for when you're looking to bring people onto your team. I always look to bring people on that maybe are stronger in certain areas or have that ability to learn or want to learn. You know, because now we get, it used to be that physical security was just physical security. Now it's also cyber security. It's really interesting. Sometimes I'll get a call and say, can you do a security assessment for us? I have to ask now. Are we talking cyber or are we talking physical? Because sometimes the two get mixed together. You know, so it's a very interesting state of where we are.
Especially since most of the systems that we always talk about are now using the network to communicate. So that's a very
Physical security and cybersecurity.
starting to mix together, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because since I've been in the security consulting business, and even when I was a practitioner at other locations, I always promoted the idea of having a closed network for your security system so that it was internal, that we didn't have to worry about it. It was a pain in the butt for the security integrators to come and do patches and those type of things because they physically had to come to the site. But now with today's technology, we're finding that we have to open up ports. And every time you go to do something else on a system, an access control system, your CCTV to provide mobile communication so people can look at things, you're opening up your network. And as you start to do that, now you're increasing your vulnerability, you're increasing your risk, and you have to really look at that and say, okay, now we need to look at the big picture. You may want to do these things, but are you willing to take the risk of doing them?
This has been very educational, and I really appreciate your time spending with us. And I can see how we both do very similar things, but what you do can really complement the type of site surveys we do and the deployment of security systems and physical security.
I almost think it makes our job more relevant because, you know, when we go and do an assessment, we're always asking questions, right? That's how we do an assessment. And one of the first things, you know, especially you talk about a camera assessment, and somebody says, well, we want a camera to watch this door. And we say, what are you looking for? Are you looking to identify the person? Or you just want to see that it's open? What do you want to do? So if you've done an SVA, site vulnerability assessment, there's probably already those questions are answered in the package. When we walk around, you say, we want to watch this door, we want to know when the door is open, and we want to be able to identify who's coming out the door and what they're carrying out. And we want it to work at nighttime and during the day. So it seems to me like that would be very complementary. It would make everybody be able to work a little bit better, because sometimes when we're doing a site assessment or when we're doing a site survey, we ask the question and the person looks back at us and doesn't really know how to answer the question. Somebody just told me we wanted a camera on this door. Okay, but how do I choose the right camera for the application? Seems that the site vulnerability assessment would identify those things and make a site survey be a lot better and a lot more inclusive as to what needs to be done.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of moving pieces, and finding the right partners to bring the project to the table, bring it to closure, is very important.
Obviously.
As we always say, the most important thing is probably to reach out to us and let us be part of that conversation. And I can certainly see where a security vulnerability assessment and working with a very experienced consultant can so complement what we do in the execution phase. So I really appreciate your time.
Nick, thank you.
Any questions,
Tom,
guys?
thanks. Steve, thank you very much.